Peter once showed me an abandoned settlement he had found back in the day. Though we were roughly the same age, I was more of a city boy than him. He had always lived out in less populated areas, and spent a lot of his childhood and teenage years exploring the forest. He rarely talked about his childhood, mainly because of his alcoholic father who beat him and his mother. But he trusted me, and sometimes he opened up, after a bottle or two. To him, exploring the wilderness was a way to escape from his dysfunctional home, which is why he had a pretty good internal map of the place. We drove for a couple of hours until we arrived at the settlement. It looked rotten and old as hell. Most of the buildings were made of wood and it was ready to collapse at any second. Some were made of your typical Soviet concrete and looked about as stable as our economy. Still, we chose to explore for a bit, just in case. After all, this place would have made for an amazing base for poachers. The houses were empty except for some damp furniture and a couple of stoves. The concrete structures, on the other hand, still had some interesting stuff lying around. We found some wet boxes of old dynamite, which led us believe this was an old mining town. Sure enough, there was a large quarry a few kilometers away, which we found later. A lot of the stuff we found were too rusted to make out what it once had been. Everything else was just in a state of decay, that made it seem pretty unsafe to fool around with too much. It's not uncommon to find old abandoned mining towns that were never put on a map, so we didn't really take a second to wonder why it had been abandoned. That is, until we spotted the fucking deer. Peter anxiously nudged my shoulder and gestured to the right of us. There was a large stag watching us from behind one of the houses. The more we looked around, the more deer we noticed. There were maybe 10 or 12 of them, just observing us. They didn't seem threatened by us, but rather like they were making sure we were on our way out of there. We slowly approached our ATVs, and these fuckers just followed us silently, never blinking or making a sound. When we got to our ATVs, we debated whether or not we should light them up. But we decided against it because we didn't want a herd of bloodthirsty demon deer charging us. We just started driving away, counting ourselves as lucky seeing as they hadn't decided to fuck us up. I remember looking back once we were 100 meters or so away and seeing well over 20 deer standing there, motionless. "Fuck that!" Peter shouted as we raced out of the area and back to town. We never went back, but often talked about it. He firmly believed that the deer had something to do with the settlement being abandoned. I'm not so sure, but I definitely don't think it's out of the question. Fuck deer and their mysterious fucking ways. At this point, the police knew of our various encounters. They didn't really believe us, but still respected us enough to not mock us. After all, we had retrieved quite a few bodies for them that had been fucked to high hell by deer. That changed when one of the officers, one of my friends, had gone missing. He had responded to a call about some kids that had claimed to have been stalked by a strange old man while they played in the forest. For some reason, he had gone out there alone to investigate. That was 16 hours ago, and nobody had heard from him since. Peter and I helped with the search since we both knew him quite well. Hours of searching yielded nothing. Then someone found his handgun lying on the ground. It had been fired twice, but we couldn't find the bullet casings. One of the officers had brought a search dog. It took a few whiffs with the gun and started darting off into the woods, obviously tracing something. We followed as best we could, but the damn thing was fast as fuck. Suddenly the woods were filled with the sound of aggressive barking and whining. We arrived at the spot where the dog had gone, and found, big surprise, a fucking deer. From one of its antlers hanged the lifeless body of the officer. It had impaled him through his throat and out of the mouth. It was so fucking grotesque that I still have a lump in my throat when I think about it. He was my friend, and that fucking deer killed him. It stood completely still, its head weighed down by the officer. The dog whimpered and snarled at it, but didn't move an inch closer to it. One of the police officers shot at it, which caused us all to light it the fuck up. Retrieving his body still stands clear in my mind as one of the hardest things I've ever done. After that incident, the officers always took our claims seriously. They even offered backup when we went on our excursions. I still wonder about that old man, though. Did the kids just imagine him? Peter still insisted that something supernatural was manipulating the deer, making them aggressive and batshit insane. I still leaned more towards the theory that the deer were just, by their very nature, batshit insane. At one point we were checking out a potential poaching camp. When we arrived, we were greeted by two older men who immediately started questioning us. We explained the situation to them and asked them to step aside so we can inspect their camp. It was a pretty standard camp with some fresh kills and pelts, but the men seemed very nervous anyway, like they were hiding something. We started questioning them until they cracked. They admitted that they had shot and killed about 7 or 8 deer the previous night, but they hadn't retrieved a single of their carcasses, and had simply fled the area. "What kind of hunter kills animals just to let them rot, huh? Why the fuck did you do it?" Peter asked them, with a sense of urgency in his voice. They explained that they had been sitting in a deer blind, waiting to take a decent shot at some unlucky deer. When they aimed at it, they saw its eyes through their scopes. It was looking directly at them, but still just walked calmly towards them. That's when they heard a twig snap, and realized their blind was being surrounded. All of them had the same lifeless look in their eyes. None of them made a noise or any sudden movements. When they had completely surrounded the blind, they started pulling some aggressive expressions and began bellowing at the hunters. Their blind was raised about 3 meters off the ground and supported by 4 wooden pillars. The deer started ramming the supports while they kept bellowing. The hunters were scared shitless and just started shooting the deer one by one. They ran back to their camp after that and hadn't been out hunting since. They showed us the way to their blind, and sure enough, there were several deer carcasses lying at the base of it. There were visible markings on the supports that backed up their claim. They then asked us if they were going to get in trouble for what they had done. We told them no, as long as they didn't do anything with the carcasses, we wouldn't press charges. Normally, we would have made them pay a fee, but seeing as they had been through an encounter with the psycho deer, we sympathized with them. In fact, we thanked them for taking care of them for us, since they were a threat to the locals. We told them that if they ever encountered aggressive deer, they should put them down immediately. They looked a bit puzzled as we drove away. Never saw them again. This is going to be the last of my posts. It's going to be a long one, but it will describe the incident that eventually led me to move to Europe. I thank all of you in advance for reading my ramblings, and I especially thank those of you who believe me. It all started when Peter got a terrible idea. He suggested that we found a central point in the forest, perhaps near a lake or anywhere near the deer were known to frequent. Then we would set up a blind in one of the biggest trees there and camp out for a week or so, shooting any deer that seemed off. At first I called him a dumbass, seeing as our job was to preserve the wildlife rather than mow it down. To be honest, I was also terrified at the thought of spending an entire week in the middle of nowhere. He called me a pussy and gave me an ultimatum. Either you go with me or I go out alone. I wasn't about to let my best friend go out there all by himself for a week. He probably knew that and used it as bait. We drove to the local hardware store and picked up the necessary equipment for our little project. Screws, wooden planks, rope, etc., etc. Then we went shopping for other supplies such as canned food and water. We loaded up our ATVs with all of our gear and set off into the wilderness. I wondered why Peter suddenly wanted us to do something so rash and stupid, but figured he had just had enough. I didn't blame him. The weird thing was, though, we had actually not experienced anything unnatural for almost half a year up until that point. Part of me wondered if he actually wanted to seek it out for some reason. He never told me why he decided to lead this crusade against the deer, but I still went with him so that I could watch his back. We eventually found a pretty large lake surrounded by big, beautiful trees. It was early August, so we weren't in any danger of freezing to death while we slept. We started building our blind, which ended up being more of a wooden platform, 5 or 6 meters above the ground with a great view of the lake. By the time we were finished, the sun was setting. We had seen no sign of wildlife while we built our blind, but figured it was due to the amount of noise we made. Our plan had one huge flaw that we had failed to realize. Fucking mosquitoes. We had no cover, and were placed right next to the goddamn mosquito capital of fucking Russia. We caught no sight of anything strange the first night, except for each other's swollen faces. At dawn the next day, we awoke to the sound of something splashing around in the water. We peeked over the edge of our blind and saw a doe, along with 2 fawns. We observed them for about 15 minutes before we determined that they were pretty normal. Similar incidents happened every once in a while the first couple of nights, nothing out of the ordinary. I felt relieved and wondered if they had migrated to some new place, planning on terrorizing some new strangers. But for some reason, Peter seemed extremely tense, and would curse under his breath. "Hey, Peter, what the fuck's going on, man?" He looked at me with a hollow expression, and sat up beside me. He explained that he had been having nightmares about the deer. He felt that if he had killed some of them, he could prove himself that he had nothing to fear. The poor guy hadn't had a decent night's sleep in well over a month at that point. He almost started crying while he told me about these things, which really showed me how close the guy was to the edge. I had to help him, so I stayed with him and kept a lookout while he took a nap. I hadn't told him anything, but I had actually been looking into how much it would cost to move away from Russia. I hadn't said anything, because I wasn't really planning on anything. Besides, I didn't feel like I could just leave him behind. I kept an eye on our surroundings for a few hours, and almost decided to just lay back and enjoy the view of the lake, when I heard something approaching to our left. Out of the tree line stepped a lone stag. I waited a bit to see if it would behave strangely before I woke Peter up. It bowed its head and motioned as if it was going to start drinking from the lake, even though it wasn't anywhere near the lake shore. That was more than enough proof for me, and I slowly shook Peter until he woke up. He instantly crawled over to the edge and looked at the deer, grinning with some sort of sadistic satisfaction. He aimed at it with his rifle and fired. A direct hit straight to the chest. He let out a sigh of relief and started laughing. We heard the sound of several animals walking around within the tree line, but never saw one of them. It almost seemed like that lone stag had been bait to see how we would react. This only fueled Peter's paranoia. He was practically trembling with fear every time we heard something wander around in the tree line. Sometimes a deer would appear on the far side of the lake, but no matter how many times Peter and I shot at it, we never hit it. At night, our main source of light was a lantern that ran on petroleum. Part of me always suspected that it was a horrible idea to use that blind made of dry wood. The fifth night into our crusade, shit hit the fan. We kept spotting eye shine of several animals, but every time we looked through our scopes, there was nothing. It felt like they were toying with us. Peter started firing shots into the air, trying to deter the creepy fuckers from whatever they were doing. But of course, it didn't work. I picked up the lantern and raised it higher in order to illuminate the ground better. When I stand up, I get lightheaded and fall over. I drop the lantern, which in turn starts a goddamn inferno. We abandon everything and just descend down our rope. My rifle was up there, along with most of my favorite gear. As we stood there in the night, the blazing blind illuminated a lot more than the lantern had. I still shudder at the thought. The largest flock of deer I had ever seen were standing in the tree line. All of their eyes were lit up from the flames, giving them a hellish appearance. Peter is practically hyperventilating at this point, and makes a dash toward our ATVs. We hit the ignition and get the fuck out of there. We never looked back to see if they followed us or anything the entire ride back. We just kept driving and letting out cries of adrenaline mixed with actual terror. When we got back, Peter just went home without saying a word. I went to my apartment and completely shut myself off from the rest of the world. Locked my door, closed the blinds, and turned off my shitty phone. I stayed that way for a couple of days. Then I got the sudden urge to get a drink. I had already consumed every bottle of alcohol in my apartment, so I went to a bar that was located on my street. When I entered, I was met with worried looks from the people who knew me. "How are you doing?" the bartender asked me with a sympathetic tone. This surprised me because none of them should have known about the shit Peter and I went through that past week. "Could have been better? Why?" I asked. "Well, after Peter's accident, you just kinda disappeared for a little while." "Peter's accident? What the fuck happened when I was in my apartment?" My expression made the situation pretty clear. "Oh shit, man, I thought you knew." Then he filled me in. Peter had packed his bags and rented some rundown car with the intention of skipping town. He had taken off in a heavily intoxicated state and had hit a tree going 120 kilometers per hour. The car was totaled and Peter had died on the spot. After a few minutes of silence, I remember standing up and just walking out of there. I walked around aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. Eventually I found myself back at my apartment complex. I noticed a piece of paper hanging out of the mailbox. I began tearing up when I read it. "My dear friend, I have decided to leave this place. I can no longer bear the shadow that looms over us, and I hope you will come and visit me someday. You helped me through some shitty times, but this time you can't help me. If you decide to come over, you can find me at..." I cried for so long that it seemed like an eternity. I still tear up as I'm typing this. After about a month or so, I decided to move out of Russia and get a fresh start. I know I can never escape my past, or the nightmares that keep resurfacing, but I can put a great distance between then and now. I still miss that crazy bastard every day, and will never forget what an amazing friend he was. I now live safely within the heart of a big city, far away from any forest. I sometimes go on drives through some of the more scenic woods, but it still feels so fake. European forests don't have the same raw feeling as the Russian forests. I sometimes miss my old home. I just wish there wasn't an abundance of terrifying animals roaming the woods. I haven't experienced anything unnatural since I moved, and I have finally learned to sleep properly at night. I regularly speak to a psychiatrist about some of my experiences and feel more in control of my fears now. Well, that's my story. Believe it, if you will. Either way, it's very real to me. And next time you get the chance, please raise a glass to Peter. Honor his memory and the man he was. Thanks to you all for reading. I'm gonna take some time to mentally recover from retelling that last one. It still hits hard. Have a good day and stay the fuck away from deer. Hello everyone, I just want to say thank you for listening. Make sure to like the video if you enjoyed this story, and subscribe if you want to hear more in the future. Click the bell icon in order to be alerted when I have more stories to tell. Until then, have a drink for Peter.